Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where you'll be introduced to insights, tools, and strategies to leverage creative living and giving. I'm your host, Donna Kim-Brand, creative brain trainer and legacy strategy coach. I help change makers and late career professionals who are deciding what's next to develop their thinking, learning, creativity, and collaboration skills, along with leadership mastery for meaningful impact in their next phase of life. The guests and show content I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This will help you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcase some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, today we're actually going to take a look at a topic I've been exploring over the summer, and that is about fostering human flourishing, particularly in the workplace. Of course, it includes life in general, but also make some specific references to human flourishing in the workplace. And, the reality is most people who work spend at least or about a third of our lives in the workplace. And that, for the average person, if there is such a thing, at least the average statistic for working people, is that adds up to about 90,000 hours in our lifetime. Now, that's a huge amount of time. And when people think about or look back or even reflect on their lives, basically, most of us want to feel it was a life well lived, not one where we were miserable and wasted our time and so on. People want people around them that they either cared about or who cared about them, be they family, colleagues, neighbors, fellow community members. People want to feel they've had their health, both physically as much as possible, even as we age and pick up a couple of ailments that might come along with living a long time on the planet. And then, of course, emotionally and mentally, people really want to be at peace, want to have few regrets, and prefer to live with a sense of optimism and positivity. Now, along with that, we want meaningful work. And it's certainly nice when you get paid and remunerated what you feel you're worth and met your needs. But also there are other elements of meaningful work, and that's either picking up a sense of impact. Maybe it's the daily environment that you work within, the people, the place, and we'll go into that in a little bit. And just the kind of vibe of the place where you show up pretty much every day in terms of a workplace. And finally, most people, really, if you ask them, they wish they'd had some fun, they've had some good laughs, they've had a few adventures, and they've had at least a few, if not many, magic moments. Now, for human flourishing to happen, it's really an orchestration. You have to kind of put on a show, act like a showman in your own life, pulling together your health, your happiness, and your sense of empowerment, along with, on the wider level of just yourself as an individual, your community, whether it's your family, your workplace colleagues, or your wider community of friends and neighbors and civic people. You want that as well, to have experiences and people which are caring, with connections, with creative engagement. When we talk about flourishing, if we start with the word flourish, and, I did spend the summer in England, and Brits are very good at flourishes, whether it's fanfare in terms of trumpets and uniforms and pageantry. They do that with a flourish, with a flair. And we also know that flourish comes out sometimes in fonts, like if you use a script font, which is very curly Q-ish and full of swirls, that's considered writing with a flourish. And then, of course, anytime we're swinging our hands around in grand gestures, making a point or showing off in some way. That's considered gesturing with a flourish. But flourishing, whether it's talking about babies or animals or your garden, it's when things thrive, when there's a possibility of development and growth, where there's a sense of contentment and even satisfaction, where things or people bloom or blossom, even bearing fruit, which we'll refer to later as results, where you can have or they can have success, whatever that means, coming into fulfillment of its potential, and a sense of prosperity and abundance. All of those notions together add up to the whole notion of flourishing. And then, of course, in a workplace, when we add the ability to have more performance, better performance, more productivity, leading to results, which might equate with bearing fruit, as I alluded before, those are situations we want. And we try to put ourselves in those circumstances. However, the current statistics are pretty scary. And despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact that we spend a third of our lives at work, there are a lot of statistics, and we do know statistics can always be manipulated and skewed and so on. But there's enough in terms of the numbers here that we ought to actually be paying attention to it. So some of the current statistics, at least in the United States, about the workplace environment are that 53% of people report they are unhappy at work. Now, the reality is they might just be unhappy people, wherever they are. And if they show up at work unhappy, then, of course, the boss has to lead them as unhappy people. You as a colleague have to put up with them being unhappy people. But there's also the consideration that the workplace itself, there are toxic elements in there that make them unhappy, and that's also something we can do something about if we're looking at human flourishing in the workplace. Now, depending on which statistic you read and whether you're talking about unengagement, not being engaged, versus disengagement, which is actually a much more active form, almost sabotage of disengagement, of removing yourself from even what you're supposed to be doing in the workplace. The statistics are between 66 and 87% of people claim they are unengaged or disengaged at work. Now, that's pretty scary when they're there being paid to do certain types of work. And another scary statistic, that out of an 8-hour day, on average, they report that only 2 hours and 48 minutes, that's just less than 3 hours, are considered productive time. Why? Well, part of that is the distraction factor. People statistically look at one of their devices or another, usually their phones, every 6 minutes. And their laptops or their portable devices and so on, when they ding and flash all kinds of impressions all the time, it pulls our attention away from what we're supposed to be doing. Obviously, there are certain roles or jobs where you want people paying attention, like with emergency response kind of situations or health-related responses where it's required. But for the most part, there's no need for that. And statistics also say that once someone loses their attention on whatever it was they were working on, it takes about 23 minutes to regain a sort of rhythm back into whatever they were doing. So if you just imagine, every 6 minutes you're interrupted and it takes 23 minutes to gain your attention back. No wonder it's under 3 hours of productive time in a day. So on top of that, we have people reporting all kinds of nasty or miserable situations at work. And they include situations like toxic stress. Now, toxic stress is stress that's often imported with employees. They show up already with what are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that make them reactive, make them scared, make them less resilient or less tolerant of conflict or demands or pressures that show up in even a normal workplace. So toxic stress, sadly, is prevalent in our current workplace and society. Now we've got people showing up with a low ability to focus or concentrate, with constant interruptions, not only on the human level, but through multiple channels of communication, all those multiple devices, and it's ongoing 24/7. People feel like they can never turn off without some sort of negative consequence. Now you've got the issue of either constant change, which is frustrating, or no change, which is also frustrating. How do you find the balance of maintaining a certain amount of stability even while your organization or your role is always needing to change? There might be organizational silos where one department doesn't know what the other one is doing. And so there are communication lapses, there are lag times in terms of getting something done. You can't finish something if somebody else doesn't do what they're supposed to, and so on. And this is rampant as well. Then, as I mentioned, the unengaged or disengaged people, irrelevance of roles or tasks within an organization. So people don't feel that what they do is significant, or at least don't know where they fit in the bigger scheme of things. And so it's a combination of the type of task, but also the personal experience of feeling irrelevant in the organization, which diminishes their motivation and their willingness to perform at a high and consistent level of productivity. And along with that, they might feel like a cog in the wheel, both undervalued and underappreciated. Now, some tasks that people take on at work aren't easy to measure. There aren't metrics for them. So people don't know if they're doing a good job if they don't get feedback, or if they get negative feedback and they don't know how to correct it. So there is this sense they can never be sure if what they're doing is the right thing, and they don't have a sense of job satisfaction. And then there's the whole thing about the customer experience being so key today, and yet every single person who walks into any work environment or has an encounter with you or anyone else in a work environment may want different things. So how do you satisfy everyone? Then there's the whole issue of anonymity. So on one hand, the employee might feel they don't matter, and so they feel, again, undervalued, underappreciated. But another negative of anonymity is people feel like they can sort of get by with minimal effort. Nobody will notice. They fly under the radar, and therefore their performance and their productivity is limited. Here's an interesting one. Graduates, most of them, are not in their intended field because the job hire rate of whatever they studied in university doesn't hire, because they lack experience, or because what they've studied is no longer a high field of demand. So when they do take a job to pay their student debts and just to live, they lack the investment of energy or longer term loyalty because it's not something they intended to do or have a particular interest in. Now you've also got the whole notion of job insecurity, both from that regard, also from the organizational perspective, in terms of the changing environment and customer demands of what they want, with high turnovers and downsizing. And that leads in turn to financial insecurity. Now, it's interesting that younger people have the financial insecurity of juggling student debt, which makes it hard to get credit, to buy cars, buy a house, to take off from work and take the vacations they need to or should. Or on the other end of the spectrum, there is the older population, the boomers, who are facing retirement, but frankly don't have sufficient retirement funding. And so they've got to keep working. And yet what's available for boomers is very often on the lower end of the pay scale. And so it just doesn't ever